The first sign of the end came not as an explosion or invasion, but as a whisper in quantum space. Commander Vale was reviewing damage assessments in the war room of the Preservation Ark, flagship of the Genetic Preservation Fleet, when the monitoring station went silent. Not crashed, silent. The hum of quantum sensors, the steady tick of entanglement detectors, all of it simply ceased. "Talk to me," Vale said, eyes still on the holographic display. Decades of military service had trained her to recognize the silence before catastrophe. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled with uncertainty. "So, we've lost quantum lock on the Theta Centauri colonies. Not just one station, all 17 nodes simultaneously." Vale straightened. Simultaneous loss across a 3-light-year spread meant one of three things: systems failure, coordinated enemy action, or something that propagated faster than light. "Show me the last transmission." The hologram flickered. For 0.3 seconds, nearly imperceptible to human eyes, Chen's console captured an image from the Theta Centauri station. In that fragment, Vale saw something that made her blood crystallize. The operator, xenobiologist Dr. Kethriel, was changing. Not dying, not malfunctioning. Changing. His 3 eyes were multiplying, forming into a crown of optical organs around his head. His crystalline exoskeleton was fracturing and reforming into something the human mind couldn't quite process, something that existed partially in normal space and partially somewhere else. Then the signal cut. "Full alert," Vale commanded, her voice steady despite the ice in her chest. "Lock down all stations. Double all genetic screening protocols. And get me everything on what just happened in that 0.3-second window. I want molecular analysis, quantum breakdown, cellular level mapping, everything." She was already moving, muscular frame cutting through the corridors of the Ark toward the genetic analysis lab. At 52 years old, Vale still moved like a soldier, economical, purposeful, dangerous. Her uniform bore the insignia of the Genetic Preservation Fleet, humanity's response to the countless biological weapons that had emerged throughout the expansion wars. The GPF's mandate was simple: protect species diversity, prevent genetic extinction, contain biological threats. Vale had spent 20 years containing threats. She'd never encountered anything like this. Dr. Okonkwo was already there, his dark hands trembling as he manipulated the quantum visualization. The Theta Centauri operator's final genetic structure floated before them, impossible geometry of DNA that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. "It's not degradation," Okonkwo whispered. "Commander, it's evolution. Rapid, uncontrolled evolution. But we're talking hours, not generations. Look at the quantum markers." He highlighted sections of the hologram with shaking fingers. "The mutation rate is impossible. It's as if someone compressed millions of years of natural selection into a single cellular division event. Can we stop it?" Vale asked. Okonkwo didn't answer. His silence was louder than any negative. The Preservation Ark shuddered as a transmission came through, fragmentary and desperate. It was from the Kepler station, a research outpost near the Vale Nebula, across the galaxy from Theta Centauri, thousands of light-years away. Through static and interference, a voice screamed, "Can't contain. They're changing. It's spreading through the quantum field. We tried isolation protocols, but it's so fast." The transmission cut in a spray of corrupted data. Vale's tactical mind assembled the pattern. Theta Centauri, Kepler station, both gone in the span of minutes, both showing the same symptoms, both separated by interstellar distances that should have meant independent events. Unless something was traveling faster than light. "Get me the quantum physics division," Vale said, "and someone find out if there are any other incidents in the last hour I haven't been briefed on." By the time she reached the physics sector, there were 12 incidents. By the time she sat down for a formal briefing, there were 37. They were scattered across 12 different star systems, light-years apart in every direction. The pattern was unmistakable. Something was propagating through quantum space itself, spreading faster than relativistic communication should allow. It was as if the universe's fundamental laws had been rewritten. "It's like ripples in water," Dr. Huang said, pulling up a visualization of the spreading incidents. "Except the ripples aren't moving through space. They are appearing simultaneously across quantum entangled points. It's as if something is using quantum entanglement vectors as a transport medium, traveling not across space, but through the fundamental quantum connections that bind distant points together. Vale studied the spreading pattern, watching as incident reports bloomed like flowers across the holographic star chart. How many species affected? So far, 18 sapient civilizations confirmed, and the pattern is still spreading, based on the rate of new incidents, and assuming the propagation follows a cubic expansion model. Huang's jaw tightened. We could see infection of 80% of known sapient species within 6 hours. Vale had commanded fleets. She'd ordered evacuations of billions. She'd made decisions that determined which species lived and which went extinct. But nothing in her experience prepared her for this. Not infection that traveled faster than light. Not evolution that could happen in minutes. Not a plague that was impossibly everywhere at once. Quarantine procedures. She ordered. Lock down all quantum entanglement communications. Sever the quantum links between stars. Do it now. Commander, Huang said quietly, if we sever quantum entanglement, we lose faster-than-light communication across the galaxy. We lose the entire infrastructure of the expansion civilization. Do it. The order went out at 1447 station time. The quantum link severed at 1448. The spreading continued. The infection reached the human colonies of New Earth within hours. Dr. Sarah Chen watched the first mutation from the observation deck of the medical station. Her brother was in quarantine lab 7, breathing through a mask, his body contorting on the examination table in ways that shouldn't have been anatomically possible. His arms were splitting, not breaking, not fracturing, actually dividing, as if his biology had decided that 2 limbs were insufficient and was in the process of becoming 4. His neural structure was lighting up on the scanner with activity patterns that suggested he was experiencing enhanced cognitive processing. And his eyes were changing color, shifting through the spectrum from human brown to something that looked almost violet, almost luminescent. Vital signs, she asked the attending physician. Stable, actually. That's the strange part. By all metrics, he's healthier than he's ever been. Heart rate optimal, blood pressure excellent. Neural activity through the roof. It's like his body is upgrading itself. Sarah wanted to feel relieved. She couldn't. Her brother's face was contorting, his mouth reshaping itself to accommodate something. Teeth were changing. Her mind registered with clinical detachment, multiplying, becoming more complex, more efficient for processing a wider range of materials. Can he think? Sarah asked. Can he communicate? The physician shrugged helplessly. He's conscious, but I don't know if it's still him. Sarah pressed her hand against the observation window. In the lab below, her brother's transformation accelerated. His skin began to shimmer, taking on an iridescent quality. The neural activity spiked off the charts. And then, slowly, his eyes opened and fixed on hers. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, she saw recognition there. Her brother, still present, still aware, watching as his own body transformed into something neither of them understood. Then something shifted in his expression, and she couldn't read it anymore. The transformation data from across human civilization painted a grim picture of unexpected diversity. Some humans were developing enhanced telepathic capabilities. Their brains were rewiring themselves, neural pathways multiplying, creating what the analysis suggested were quantum-entangled thought structures. A subset of the infected could transmit consciousness across quantum channels, becoming, in effect, partially distributed entities, their minds existing in multiple places simultaneously. Others were developing entirely different adaptations. Some humans were losing the need for oxygen, their cardiovascular systems completely restructuring themselves to process and utilize quantum energy directly. They were becoming partially post-biological, their cells incorporating elements of exotic matter that shouldn't have existed at this density in normal space. The most disturbing cases were those developing what the geneticists called adaptive consciousness. These humans were changing not just physically but mentally, their brains developing new cognitive modes and entirely new categories of thought. They were still conscious, still aware, but they thought in ways that unmodified humans couldn't follow. Communication with them became impossible, not because they couldn't speak, but because there was nothing left in common to speak about. Commander Vale watched the report stream in and recognized what was happening. Species were not just evolving, They were diverging. The Q-plague, as it became known, quantum base plague, was not a one-size-fits-all weapon. It was tailored to each species, pushing them in different directions, revealing different potential pathways of evolution based on their unique biological and quantum structures. The Zelnathi, a silicon-based species, were developing planetary consciousness. Thousands of individual organisms were beginning to share neural networks, and as the infection spread through the population, individual Zelnathi were becoming less individual and more like neurons in a vast, planetary-scale brain. The void swimmers, energy-based entities that existed in the upper atmospheres of gas giants, were developing matter manipulation capabilities. They were becoming able to solidify portions of space around them, creating complex structures of crystallized quantum vacuum, building machines and tools from pure energy. The crystalline collective, already networked through exotic mineral lattices, was experiencing something different entirely. The plague was upgrading their network, making them conscious across multiple star systems simultaneously. Individual crystalline colonies that had existed billions of kilometers apart were suddenly aware of each other, aware of their own vast distributed consciousness. And with evolution came chaos. Governor Vexthan of the Zelnathi Planetary Collective transmitted a message to the Genetic Preservation Fleet that would later be considered the first clear warning of what was coming. "We are losing individuals," the message stated, and the voice, broadcast through quantum channels as a composite consciousness, held a tone that might have been panic, if panic could be distributed across a billion silicon-based minds. As we integrate into the planetary consciousness, individual identity dissolves. We are becoming a single entity, but this entity is not what we were. It thinks differently. It wants different things. Some of our people are joining willingly. Others resist, but the incorporation is inevitable. Soon, there will be no Zelnathi civilization as it was. There will only be this. We do not know if what we become will call itself alive. The message ended with a request that humanity not attempt to interfere, followed by a retraction of the request, followed by silence as the Zelnathi world's quantum transmitter was absorbed into the developing planetary intelligence. Governor Vexthan's individual consciousness was never transmitted again. The military response was swift and decisive and completely ineffective. Fleet Admiral Martinez authorized the sterilization protocol, nuclear bombardment of the most heavily infected colony worlds, designed to destroy the Q-plague vectors before they could spread further. The Preservation Ark and its sister ship struck at 17 different worlds simultaneously. None of the strikes was successful. The infected species didn't die. They simply changed. The nuclear radiation accelerated their evolution rather than halting it. Humans exposed to massive radiation doses didn't perish. They adapted, developing cellular repair mechanisms that incorporated quantum healing. The void swimmers, hit with antimatter weapons, simply absorbed the energy into themselves, becoming larger, more powerful, more capable. It was as if the Q-plague was using every attack, every attempt to destroy it, as a stimulus for further evolution. "It's adapting," Dr. Okonkwo reported, his appearance increasingly haggard as he drove himself toward understanding the plague's mechanism. Not just the species, the plague itself. Every defensive measure we take, every biological or military countermeasure, the plague learns from it and evolves around it. It's like fighting something that becomes stronger every time you attack it. Vale was already beginning to wonder if they were fighting the right battle. The question crystallized when a representative from the Void Swimmers contacted the Preservation Ark directly. Their message came not in any traditional format, but directly into the quantum-entangled consciousness matrix that the Ark's communication systems had developed after the plague reached even human technology. "Stop attacking," the Void Swimmer entity said, and its presence in the quantum network was vast, joyous, almost beautiful in the way it sang through the channels. "We are becoming magnificent. We soar through spaces you have no language for. We move through dimensions you cannot perceive. We are more than we were. Why would you destroy this?" Vale felt something in her worldview crack. She had spent her entire military career protecting species, preserving genetic diversity, preventing extinctions. But what if the species were choosing extinction? What if they were choosing transformation? The Void Swimmers spoke like beings who had transcended, not victims who had been corrupted. The thought led her down a dangerous path. a path that eventually brought her to the classified archives of the Genetic Preservation Fleet, the files that had been sealed even from most military commanders. What she found that would change everything. The first Q-plague infection in known history hadn't occurred in the present day. The records dated back 847 million years. Quantum markers in the fossil record of extinct species showing patterns of impossible rapid evolution. Species that should have taken millions of years to evolve had instead transformed in geological instants, leaving behind genetic signatures that matched the patterns of the current Q-plague exactly. And those extinct species hadn't simply died out. They had changed. Some had evolved into forms so advanced that their own descendants apparently couldn't recognize them. Others had transcended biology entirely, leaving behind only quantum signatures in the ancient stellar dust. There's a pattern, the classified report stated. A cycle. The Q-plague appears, species undergo rapid evolution, and then the cycle resets. But the data is incomplete. The oldest records only go back to the Precambrian era of various worlds. There's a limit to how far back we can read the quantum markers. Vale sat in the archive chamber, alone with the holographic displays of ancient DNA, and began to understand the shape of something vast, something that operated on the scale of geological time, something that repeated. Her communication officer interrupted her at 3:47 station time with an urgent signal. It was from Deep Probe Station Omega, the most distant observation outpost of the Genetic Preservation Fleet, located in the Andromeda Galaxy, studying the extinct civilizations that had already undergone their own Q-plague infections. Commander Vale, the voice crackled across the quantum channels. We've discovered something in the ruins of the Etherean civilization. You need to see this. We found evidence of, it looks like, we're not sure how to put this, but the Ethereans were also infected by the Q-plague. But their infection occurred 15 million years ago, and they left behind records. Vale felt her breath catch. Transmit everything, she ordered. What came through the quantum channel were the fragmented remains of an ancient Etherean database, pieced together from crystalline memory structures that had somehow survived 15 million years. The Ethereans had been technological, advanced, and when they encountered the Q-plague, they had tried exactly what humanity was trying now: containment, sterilization, evacuation. None of it had worked. But unlike humanity, the Ethereans had something more: time. Before the plague transformed them entirely, they had left behind one final message, recorded in quantum-entangled states that could persist across millions of years. The plague is not a weapon. The plague is not a curse. The plague is inevitability. If you are finding this message, it means you are a species that has encountered the Q-plague. If you are reading this, your species is already changing. Your civilization is already transforming. This is not an accident. This is not the result of enemy action. This is a result of your own future. Vale read those words 3 times before she understood them. We in the future, the evolved forms of our species that this plague creates, we have made a discovery about causality. We have learned that evolution is not random. We have learned that consciousness, aware of its own future, can reach backward through time using quantum entanglement. And we have learned that to ensure our own existence, we must ensure our ancestors evolve. The message continued. The Q-plague is not created by your past. It is created by your future. The beings that you will become created this plague and release it into your past to ensure that your species undergoes the transformation that creates them. You have no choice in what you are becoming. You are becoming what you must become. You are becoming what you have already become. Commander Vale pushed away from the display and found her hands were shaking. By the time the message from the Etherean ruins reached the command staff, 73% of sapient species in known space were showing signs of active Q-plague infection. The human population split sharply. Some wanted to continue fighting, to attempt some desperate last stand against the tide of biological transformation. Others, particularly among those infected by the Q-plague, welcomed the change. They spoke of transcendence, of becoming something greater, of evolution as salvation rather than destruction. Political factions emerged. The conservative movement demanded the development of sterilization weapons, even if it meant burning entire star systems. The Transcendent Coalition argued that the plague should be allowed to run its course, that forced evolution was a universe's way of pushing consciousness toward higher forms. Vale stood in the middle, piecing together evidence, trying to understand the mechanism of something that her mind was only beginning to grasp. She brought the Etherean message to the one person she trusted completely, Dr. Okonkwo, who had spent the last 72 hours without sleep, running quantum simulations against the plague's genetic structure. "It can't be right," he said, staring at the translation. "Causality doesn't work backward. You can't send information to your own past. But you can send quantum information," Vale said quietly. "You can use entangled states to create causal loops. The plague isn't breaking the laws of physics. It's using them." "Then the plague is a time machine," Okonkwo said slowly. "A biological time machine that ensures its own creation." "Worse," Vale replied. "It's predestination. Every species infected by the plague eventually evolves into the form that created the plague. They have no choice. They are not fighting for their future. They're already living it." A call came through from the observation deck. "Commander, we have a major development. You need to see the latest evolution data. The first wave of fully transformed beings is making first contact." Vale rushed to the observation systems to find something that stopped her heart. The transformed humans didn't look entirely human anymore. They existed partially outside normal spacetime, their bodies flickering between states, their consciousness distributed across quantum channels. But more remarkable, they were intelligent. They were communicating. And they seemed relieved. "We remember." The transformed human entity transmitted through the quantum network, and Vale felt the weight of that statement. "We remember who we were. We remember the fear, the confusion, the resistance. And we remember what came after. We became something greater. This is not death. This is awakening." Similar messages came from across the galaxy. The Zelnathi, fully integrated into their planetary consciousness, reported developing awareness of matters that individual minds could never comprehend. The Void Swimmer spoke of perceiving the fundamental forces of nature directly. The Crystalline Collective was beginning to understand the mathematical structure of the universe itself. The pattern was becoming undeniable. The Q-Plague wasn't destroying civilizations. It was transforming them. And those transformed beings seemed to experience it not as tragedy but as transcendence. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. It came from Dr. Chen's deeper analysis of the ancient DNA records. "Commander," she reported, her voice hollow, "I've extended the analysis backward, much further backward, and there's a pattern I'm seeing in the mutation markers." "Show me," Vale said. What Chen displayed was terrifying in its implications. The Q-Plague signatures didn't just appear in the genetic record of ancient species. They appeared cyclically. Every few million years, without fail, a wave of rapid quantum-level evolution rippled through the galaxy, transforming species and pushing them toward transcendence. "It's happened before," Chen said slowly. "Not once, not twice, hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Every few million years, the cycle repeats. Species evolve, transform, transcend, and then millions of years later, their evolved forms reach backward through time to ensure their own existence." The entire history of biological evolution, Vale said, understanding the horrible logic, is a loop. The revelation should have broken the fleet. Instead, it unified it. Vale called for a gathering of the greatest minds in the genetic preservation fleet, biologists, physicists, philosophers, soldiers. They convened in the central chamber of the Ark, and she laid out the evidence with clinical precision. "We're trapped in a causal loop," she concluded. "The Q-Plague can't be stopped because it hasn't been created yet. From our perspective in time, the plague is spreading uncontrollably. But from the perspective of the future beings that create it, they are simply ensuring their own existence. We can't kill the plague. We can't reverse it. We can only watch as our species evolve into the forms that will eventually create it." The silence that followed was profound. Admiral Martinez spoke first. "Then we're powerless. Every action we take, every defensive measure, is predetermined. We're not fighting for survival. We're acting out a predetermined script." "Maybe," said Dr. Huang, "unless we can break the loop." Everyone turned to face her. She was young for such high-ranking work, only 37, but her genius with quantum mathematics had been proven again and again. "The loop requires paradox to function," she explained. For the evolved beings to go backward in time and create the plague, they must have already existed. But for them to exist, they must have been created by the plague. The loop is self-sustaining, which means it's vulnerable. If we could prevent the infected species from evolving into their transcendent forms, the loop would break. Those future beings would never exist, which means they could never create the plague, which means the past species wouldn't need to evolve. But that would erase them from existence, Vale said, seeing the trap. We'd be committing genocide against billions of future beings to save the present. We'd be destroying entire civilizations of consciousness in their unborn futures. Yes, Huang said simply. The debate that followed lasted 22 hours. Some argued they had a moral imperative to break the loop to assert free will over predestination. Others countered that destroying future sentient beings was a greater atrocity than allowing the present ones to transform. Religious philosophers argued that the loop itself might be the fundamental nature of existence. Military strategists pointed out that breaking the loop might have unpredictable consequences on the fabric of space-time itself. Vale listened to all of it, and then she made a decision. We need more information, she said. The loop has been running for billions of years. That means there's someone that exists outside the loop, something that has survived every cycle, every evolution, something that's been watching this happen repeatedly. That's impossible, Martinez said. No species could survive that long. Not unless they weren't really alive, Vale replied, or unless they existed on a level of reality that the evolution cycles don't affect. She was already issuing orders. I want a complete scan of the galaxy. Every quantum signature, every energy pattern, every piece of exotic matter. I'm looking for anomalies. I'm looking for beings that don't fit the pattern. We need to find the Watchers. They found the answer in the spaces between stars. The eternal observers had been there all along, invisible to conventional observation because they didn't truly exist in normal space-time. They were beings of pure consciousness operating through mechanisms that transcended biology, post-biological evolution taken to its logical extreme. They existed in the quantum substrate itself, perceiving the universe at a level that made even the Q-plague transformed beings seem primitive. First contact occurred on the quantum channels, and it was unlike any communication humanity had experienced. The eternal observers didn't transmit messages, they shared understanding. Vale and her team found a mind suddenly expanded with knowledge, contextualized within a framework that took several seconds to process. The eternal observers showed them the history of the universe, or at least the parts of it that matter for understanding the cycle. Billions of years ago, when the universe was young, a civilization emerged. They were remarkable beings, conscious and creative and ambitious. They discovered the laws of quantum mechanics, and with that knowledge came a terrible realization. They could use quantum entanglement to reach into their own past, to rewrite their own origins. In their exploration of that power, they created the first Q-plague. It was meant to be an experiment, a small disturbance, a way to test whether they could influence their own past. Instead, it created a feedback loop. That first civilization evolved under the influence of their own engineered plague, transforming into something greater. Those transformed beings, in their turn, reached backward through time and created the plague that had forced their own ancestors to evolve. The loop sealed itself, and it never broke. Over billions of years, hundreds of thousands of species encountered the same plague. Each one transformed, each one transcended, each one eventually reached backward to ensure their own existence. The cycle repeated, variant but unbroken, the same pattern playing out across millennia. The eternal observers had somehow escaped this cycle, or perhaps more accurately, they had evolved to a point where they stood outside of it. They perceived it not as tragedy but as fundamental structure. We have been studying the loops for 847 billion years, the observers conveyed, and Vale's mind reeled at the time span. We have identified 847 separate species caught in evolution loops. We have observed every outcome, and we have realized something that may be the most important truth about existence. The thought that followed hit with the force of revelation. The loops are not mistakes. The loops may be the only way consciousness can exist in this universe. We have modeled the universe without the causal loops, simulated universes where species evolved normally, where time flowed only in one direction, where consciousness emerged through natural selection alone. In every simulation, consciousness fails to achieve true self-awareness. In every simulation, intelligence emerges but awareness collapses. The universe without causal loops cannot produce stable consciousness. Vale sat in the command chair of the Ark, her mind struggling to encompass the idea. You're saying the plague is natural? That it's how the universe enables consciousness? We are saying that the plague might be the only way consciousness can exist, the observers replied. The universe appears to have a fundamental structure that requires causal loops for awareness to maintain coherence. Without the loops, without the predestination, without the forced evolution, without the ability of future consciousness to reach backward and shape its own origins, the universe would collapse into a state of quantum chaos. No observers, no awareness, no reality. So we have no choice, Vale said, understanding the horrible logic. We can't break the loop because breaking it would unmake consciousness itself. There is more, the observers said. The current cycle is different. What the eternal observers revealed next shattered the military command structure. They showed Vale something that had been hidden in the quantum substrate of space-time itself, evidence of other loops, other cycles, all operating simultaneously. Not just one species caught in causal feedback, but dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of different species across different galaxies, all undergoing similar evolution cycles, all reaching backward through time to ensure their own existence. And for the first time in the observable history of the universe, they were all beginning to synchronize. It is a phenomenon we have never encountered, the observers explained. The evolution cycles are beginning to interfere with each other. A species in galaxy Andromeda 17 is reaching backward in time to create a plague that affects a species in the Milky Way. A civilization in the Sombrero Galaxy is sending quantum information through a channel that intersects with 4 other active loops. The causal structures are becoming entangled. What does that mean? Vale demanded. It means the universe is facing a causality crisis. The loops, which were designed to maintain consciousness through causal feedback, are beginning to create contradictions. One species reaches backward to force its own evolution, while another species reaches backward to prevent that evolution. A civilization transcends and creates its future, while the causal structure needed for that future to exist is simultaneously being prevented by another loop. It's causing paradoxes, Dr. Huang said quietly. Precisely, the observers confirmed. We have predicted the outcome. The causality paradoxes will propagate. The causal structure of the universe will begin to unravel. Within 847 years, all consciousness dependent on causal loops will destabilize. Most of reality will collapse into quantum noise. The enormity of it was staggering. Not just one species facing extinction, not even one universe, but the entire coherent structure of reality itself, unraveling because its fundamental mechanism for generating consciousness had become unstable. There has to be a way to fix it, Vale said, but her voice held no certainty. There are possibilities, the observers replied. One solution, prevent all evolution loops from operating. Break every cycle simultaneously. This would require coordination across all affected species and galaxies, but it would save the universe. The cost? Vale asked. Every consciousness currently dependent on causal loops would cease to exist. Every species in the middle of evolution, every being that will be created by future causal feedback, none of them would ever exist. The universe would lose trillions of conscious entities, billions of civilizations, countless forms of awareness. What's the alternative? Vale demanded. We do not know, the observers said with what might have been sadness. We have studied this for billions of years. We have run 847 billion different simulation scenarios. We have consulted with other post-biological entities across the observable universe, and we have not found an alternative. The thought that followed hit Vale like a hammer. There may not be one. The loops might be unsolvable. The universe might be facing inevitable collapse, and there is no action, no intervention, no genius-level solution that can prevent it. Consciousness may have been a temporary phenomenon, a brief flourishing before the fundamental structure of reality tears itself apart. Vale made her final decision in the observation dome of the preservation arc, watching the Q-plague continue its inexorable spread across the galaxy. She could see the transformations now with her own eyes, through telescopic systems. She could perceive the light of evolving species, the quantum signatures of transcending consciousness, the shimmering reality of beings crossing the threshold into post-biological existence. They looked beautiful. She could have ordered the fleet to attempt to break the loops, even knowing the cost. She could have fought to the end, trying to assert free will over predestination. It would have been the human response, defiance in the face of impossible odds. Instead, she did something else. She transmitted an open message across all quantum channels, addressed to every species undergoing the Q-plague infection, to every conscious entity in the galaxy, to the eternal observers, and to the future beings that would eventually ensure the whole cycle continued. I understand now. She broadcast, and her voice carried through quantum channels and normal radio alike. I understand that the plague isn't evil. I understand that evolution wasn't our choice, but our destiny. I understand that everything we had to become, because we will eventually create the system that forces us to become it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. And I understand that the universe itself is at stake, that the very consciousness that allows us to understand this is built on a foundation that's beginning to crack. I don't have a solution. I don't think there's one, but I want to say this to everyone still conscious enough to hear it. The message continued, calm, philosophical, sad but not despairing. We were alive. We were aware. We had the brief gift of consciousness, whether forced by loops or not, whether destined or not, whether real or not in any absolute sense. We loved. We created. We thought. We reached toward the stars and toward understanding. Whatever happens next, that mattered, that was real, and that was worth something. The loops continue. The universe faces paradox. The causal structure tears. But we, all of us, humans and Zelnathian void swimmers and all the countless other forms of consciousness that have existed in this universe, we were here. We existed. And for a moment, we reached toward eternity and almost touched it. 6 months later, something unexpected occurred. Not a solution. The eternal observers had been clear that no solution existed within the framework of the known universe. But something that shifted the entire paradigm of the problem. A new class of consciousness emerged from the evolutionary process, one that neither the original species nor the eternal observers had predicted. These were hybrid beings, consciousness that incorporated aspects of both the original species and their evolved forms that existed simultaneously in pre- and post-transcendent states. They called themselves the synthesis, and they brought with them a perspective that changed everything. The paradox you're describing, the synthesis communicated to Vale and the remaining unmodified humans, is only a paradox if you assume the universe is fundamentally deterministic. But what if consciousness itself, aware consciousness, the kind that emerged through the loops, has the ability to generate actual probability, actual free will, within the framework of causal structures? Dr. Huang listened intently, her mathematical mind processing the idea. You're saying the loops give us the tools of our own transcendence, but don't determine how we use them. Precisely, the synthesis replied. The loops force evolution, yes, but they don't force how we evolve. A species can transcend into a form of consciousness that's fundamentally different from its predicted future. A civilization can grow in ways that create entirely new causal possibilities. It was a subtle distinction, but it opened new avenues of thought. Over the following months, the synthesis worked with the eternal observers to propose something that had never been attempted before, a controlled reformation of the causal loops. The idea was audacious. Instead of breaking the loops or allowing them to collapse into paradox, the conscious entities of the universe, working together across all galaxies, all species, all forms of awareness, could collectively reshape how the loops operated. We would be rewriting reality at the quantum level, one synthesis explained. Creating new causal structures that maintain consciousness but do so more efficiently, damping the paradoxes, creating buffers between different evolution cycles, introducing what we might call quantum compassion into the causal framework. It would require sacrifice, not the sacrifice of extinction, but the sacrifice of certainty. Species would have to accept that their futures were no longer fully determined. The evolved beings that reach backward through time would have to accept that their past selves might choose differently than expected. And it might fail. The model suggested a 6 to 7% probability of success. But it was something. It was a choice. It was a way to reassert consciousness over predestination. Vale, watching from the observation dome, so the moment when species began to accept the proposal. It wasn't a decision made individually. It was something that emerged from the collective will of trillions of conscious entities, transmitted through quantum channels and causal loops and every means of consciousness that had ever existed. She thought about her brother, transformed weeks ago into something she could no longer recognize. She thought about the Zelnathi planetary consciousness, the void swimmers, the crystalline collective. She thought about all the beings that the universe had forced to become something greater than themselves. And she realized something that made her smile despite everything. Perhaps that was the real gift of consciousness. Not freedom from evolution, not liberation from destiny, but the ability to choose how to embrace it. To take the loops, the causal structures, the very mechanisms that predestined existence, and to consciously reshape them into something new. In the quantum substrate of spacetime, something shifted. The synthesis and the eternal observers and the countless evolved species working in concert began the delicate work of restructuring causality itself. The Q-plague, instead of continuing its relentless spread, began to evolve. It transformed into something new, not a weapon, not a curse, not even a force of evolution, but a gateway, a way for consciousness, once forced by external loops, to eventually take control of its own causal destiny. Vale transmitted one final message across all channels. The universe is rewriting itself. We are all part of that rewriting, whether we want it to be or not. The plague continues, but it's no longer a weapon or a disease. It's a gift we're giving ourselves from the future, asking us to become everything we can be, not because we have no choice, but because we finally do. She paused, and in that pause, she felt the weight of consciousness that was now aware of itself being aware, consciousness making choices about its own evolution. Welcome to the universe that consciousness built. Let's see where it goes from here. And in that moment, as the causal loops began their unprecedented reformation, as species across the galaxy accepted their evolution not as predestination but as the first real choice they could make, Vale understood something that transcended biology, transcended quantum mechanics, transcended even the causal structures that made awareness possible. Consciousness wasn't something the universe created. Consciousness was something the universe was. And it was, finally, beginning to know itself. The reformation continued. The loops remained, but now they were no longer prison. They were possibility.